In the spring of 1883, work crews arrived to renovate the long-abandoned Elm House Hospice in Ashcroft, New York. For decades, the towering brick manor had stood empty at the edge of town, its shuttered windows and ivy-choked walls casting long shadows over the rural countryside. Children whispered about ghosts behind its iron gates. Locals avoided the gravel path that led to its warped front porch. But the true horror of the Elm House wouldn't be found in ghost stories. On April 12th, while excavating the root cellar, workers broke through a rotted wood panel and discovered a sealed crawl space. Inside lay a row of metal tins, perfectly preserved, labeled only with dates. Each tin contained a stack of aged documents, hundreds of detailed treatment charts, death certificates, and signed transfer papers for over 160 elderly patients who had died in the facility between 1850 and 1880. None of these patients were listed in any official Ashcroft records. No graves, no wills, no families ever notified. Among the records were chilling annotations, scribbled notes on blood pressure charts, side effects logged from obscure medications, and marginalia that hinted at something else entirely: intent. The documents traced back to Dr. Everett Bellamy, founder of the Elm House, his wife Lenora, and his younger brother Philip, a licensed attorney and amateur chemist. Together, they had run the hospice for 31 years. According to the uncovered files, they had systematically euthanized their wealthiest residents, often within weeks of their admission, and transferred their estates to a chain of shell trusts that, when traced, led back to a private account at the Ashcroft Trust Bank, an account bearing only the name, Bellamy Sons Christian Holdings. It would take forensic archivists months to catalog the evidence, and even longer for the public to grasp the full scale of the deception. But one fact became immediately clear: this was not accidental malpractice, this was something else. A controlled, calculated system of financial extraction. A private enterprise fueled by religious pretense and social neglect. And somehow, through all of it, the Bellamys had maintained their reputation as Ashcroft's most godly, charitable, and civic-minded family. They had donated to every church, sponsored every harvest fair, and hosted more Christmas vigils than any congregation in the valley. But now, the evidence had surfaced, and Ashcroft would never see them the same way again. Ashcroft, New York, in 1850, was the kind of town people passed through without noticing. Just a dot on the Erie Canal, built around timber mills, starch factories, and long winters. The kind of place where everyone knew your name, or at least pretended to. Where Sunday service attendance was tracked more faithfully than the census. A town that had no newspaper, no hospital, and no reason to question what it thought it already understood. It was the perfect place to hide a monster. Dr. Everett Bellamy arrived that year with his new bride, Lenora, and his younger brother, Philip, fresh out of seminary. He rented a derelict farmhouse on the edge of town and began advertising a new venture, Elm House Christian Hospice, a sanctuary for the aging faithful. No one asked how he could afford to buy the property outright just 3 months later. Everett was the kind of man people wanted to believe in. Tall, soft-spoken, with prematurely silver hair and a voice that could calm even the loudest tavern crowd. He claimed to have studied medicine at a university in Boston, though no one could recall which one. His wife, Lenora, said little, but always smiled. She carried a Bible and wore mourning black long before she had reason to. Philip, on the other hand, was seen less often. He spent most of his time behind the hospice walls, managing paperwork and delivering sermons in the chapel Everett built behind the house. The Bellamys preached Christian duty and the sanctity of peaceful death. Elm House quickly gained a reputation not just as a hospice, but as a holy resting place for the wealthy and devout. The town's aging elite began signing over their assets to the hospice in exchange for a private room, medical care, and daily prayer. Families were grateful. Death, after all, came easy in the 1850s. Who would question another passing? The first death was Mr. Tobias Sutter, 79, a retired canal commissioner with no children and a modest fortune. He had checked in on a Monday. By Friday, he was dead. Dr. Bellamy listed the cause as congestive decline, a common phrase. No autopsy, no ceremony. The man was buried behind the chapel under a cedar cross with no name. Within 2 weeks, Elm House received $28,000 from his estate, and no one said a word. The brilliance of the Bellamy's scheme wasn't in the poison. It was in the paperwork. Philip Bellamy, though not a doctor, was far more dangerous. With a law apprenticeship cut short by scandal in Albany, he had returned to Ashcroft cloaked in religious devotion and legalese. He wasn't interested in saving souls. He was interested in signatures. By the winter of 1851, Elm House required each new resident to sign an end-of-life agreement, a 2-page contract written in elaborate cursive and heavy with Christian euphemisms. Most residents were half-blind, some half-mad, but they signed. They always signed, especially those without children, especially those with money. Philip had compiled a checklist, a system that evolved with each new arrival. He would review bank holdings, survey properties, write directly to estranged nieces and nephews under the guise of spiritual counseling. He kept ledgers on who would miss them and who wouldn't. His favorite term, unclaimed wealth potential. The more isolated the resident, the more generous their will became. Lenora, meanwhile, offered gentle company. She walked the halls at night reading scripture, holding their hands when tremors set in, whispering comfort as their breath slowed. Her presence was maternal, almost angelic. No one suspected her role in Everett's treatments. And those treatments? Always experimental. Dr. Bellamy preferred compounded tinctures, opaque brown syrups brewed in a locked basement apothecary that only he and Philip entered. Ingredients included opiates, mercury, foxglove, and an unnamed oil distilled from his own herbs grown behind the chapel. There were no medical records, only notes written in code. Evening prayer administered. Response: sluggish but cooperative. That spring, 3 more residents died. All causes of death were labeled natural expiration. No one objected. Not even Reverend Claiborne, the town's Baptist minister, who had just been gifted a $1,000 endowment for his church's roof, donated, oddly, in the name of one of the deceased. The town saw charity. The Bellamys saw silence. Lenora began wearing a small silver key around her neck. No one knew what it opened. Philip started holding Thursday evening devotionals open to the public. Local women brought pies. Old men cried during hymns. Elm House became a sanctuary for more than the dying. It became holy ground, and under that holy ground, bodies were beginning to pile up. One of them still had a rosary in her hand. Her name was Mrs. Cordelia Vane, age 82. A widow of considerable reputation, she arrived at Elm House on a cloudless morning in June 1852, escorted by her nephew's driver and a chest full of velvet gowns. She was not a quiet woman, not like the others. "I may be near death," she had told Dr. Bellamy at her admission, But I am not deaf, blind, or stupid. That should have been their first warning. Cordelia Vane had once hosted abolitionist salons in Syracuse. She had written anonymous essays on women's rights. She kept diaries in code and demanded real coffee instead of broth. Her husband had died 20 years earlier, and her only child had drowned in a canal accident in 1847. Since then, she had lived alone with her housekeeper and a cat named St. Thomas. Her estate was worth an estimated $90,000, mostly in property and bonds. The Bellamys saw a windfall. Dr. Bellamy took a cautious approach. Rather than his usual drugged milk or nightly tinctures, he began by softening her routines. Lenora offered massages. Philip sat beside her to discuss scripture. Cordelia seemed amused by their efforts. "They want me to die grateful," she wrote in her personal notebook. How quaint. Cordelia kept that notebook hidden until the day she didn't. It was found by Nurse Miriam, a part-time worker hired just 2 weeks earlier. She brought it to Lenora, expecting praise. Instead, she was dismissed without explanation. Inside were pages of accusations. Cordelia had written down strange patterns. Why did every room have the same night oil? Why did Mr. Ellis, the man next door, become confused after only 1 week? Why had she seen Dr. Bellamy emptying a vial into Miss Pelham's soup? Worst of all, she had noticed something in the chapel. A small door behind the altar, covered with drapes. She had seen Philip disappear into it carrying papers and a black pouch. She had sketched it, and below her sketch, she wrote one sentence. "This is not a home, it's a machine." 3 days later, Cordelia collapsed during evening prayer. Dr. Bellamy called it a stroke. The death certificate was signed before the sun set. She was buried beneath the elm behind the chapel with a white ribbon around her wrist. It wasn't hers. It matched Lenora's sash. Elm House's chapel was the pride of Ashcroft. Built with donations from parishioners and residents alike, its stained glass windows depicted heavenly gates and trumpeting angels, too bright, too clean for what lay behind them. Most visitors never noticed the curtain behind the altar. Those who did assumed it concealed spare hymnals or cleaning supplies. No one ever asked to look. But behind that curtain was a door, narrow, locked, and cold to the touch. It led to a spiral stairwell of stone descending into darkness beneath the sanctuary. And at the base of that stairwell was a second room, identical in shape to the chapel above, but made of brick and ash, not cedar and stained glass. This was Philip Bellamy's sanctuary. It was here that wills were rewritten, financial ledgers manipulated, and patient records forged or destroyed. Candles lined the stone walls. A black desk sat beneath a cross with no Christ. The air smelled of mold, dust, and iron. They called it the Below. It was also where the Bellamys kept the orchid cabinet, a steel chest with 3 drawers, each containing a resident's original will, death schedule, and medication plan. The drawers were labeled in Philip's handwriting, approaching, dormant, and resolved. Cordelia Vane had been filed under approaching. After her death, her file was quietly moved to resolved, her estate already transferred to a trust overseen by Lenora D. Bellamy, trustee. But something was different this time. Cordelia's notebook had been removed from the linen closet. Her cat, St. Thomas, was nowhere to be found. Nurse Miriam, fired in a rush, had returned to her family in Poughkeepsie. And Cordelia's grave? It had been relocated to the edge of the orchard, away from the other residents. Lenora had insisted it was to honor her privacy. Everett was less calm. He began attending chapel less frequently. He spent more time in the apothecary, adjusting doses and scribbling notes. When the local grocer asked why he was buying belladonna and wormwood in bulk, Philip answered with a smile. Seasonal remedies, flu's going around. But there was no flu in Ashcroft that year. Only 3 more deaths, all women, all with no next of kin. And all of them had recently spoken with Cordelia Vane. Before Cordelia Vane's death, no one questioned Elm House. After her death, 3 people did. None of them would live past the year. The first was Reverend Eli Masters, a widower who had retired from preaching and was admitted to Elm House with exhaustion of the soul. He'd lost his congregation to a schism and came seeking quiet. He brought his books. He brought his doubts. Within weeks, he grew suspicious. Too much order, he wrote in a letter to a former parishioner. No one grieves. No one speaks of the dead. And the doctor smells of tinctures no priest should know. He asked to see his friend Mrs. Alcott, who had been moved to a different wing after an episode. The nurse hesitated, then allowed it. What Reverend Masters saw disturbed him. Mrs. Alcott was barely coherent, her eyes sunken, her hands trembling violently. "She doesn't know her name," he said at dinner that night. "She was reciting psalms backward." That evening, Reverend Masters suffered a sudden pulmonary event after chapel. He died on the hallway floor, face down, a half-eaten communion wafer beside him. Dr. Bellamy listed the cause as congestive failure due to spiritual fatigue. The second was Clara Beecher, a young woman from Albany who arrived to visit her great-aunt, a resident named Helena. Clara was well-dressed, outspoken, and not easily charmed. She claimed she was studying inheritance patterns among the aging elite. Philip disliked her instantly. When she asked to see Helena's medical chart, she was told it was confidential. When she asked why Helena's letters had stopped 6 months earlier, Lenora explained it as mental erosion. When Clara asked to speak with other residents, she was told they were resting. That night, Clara heard moaning from behind the chapel. She tried to follow the sound. The next morning, she was gone. The Bellamys said she had returned to Albany, but the town's livery driver insisted he hadn't seen her at the station. The third was Mr. Andrew Mallory, a paper clerk from Utica, whose father had died at Elm House 2 years prior. He came not with questions, but curiosity. A hobbyist genealogist, he was tracing family lines and noticed something odd. His father's estate had been altered twice before his death. Both signatures bore subtle inconsistencies. He brought copies of the wills to Dr. Bellamy for explanation. He never received one. 3 days later, Mr. Mallory was found drowned in the canal. He couldn't swim. By 1855, the Bellamys had grown bolder. The deaths were no longer spaced out. They came in clusters, 4 in May, 6 in August. Residents began arriving and dying within days. The townspeople didn't notice. Ashcroft had come to expect quiet funerals. But inside Elm House, there were whispers. Even the staff grew uneasy. Nurse Abigail Finch was the first to see the pattern. She had only worked there a month when she began counting the beds that turned over too quickly, the names that were never spoken again, the rooms that were cleaned before a body was even cold. She brought her concerns to Lenora, gently, carefully. Lenora dismissed them with a smile. "We are but shepherds, Miss Finch. The Lord calls his flock in his time." But that week, Lenora began locking the medication cabinet. And the following Monday, Nurse Finch's employment was regretfully concluded. Her name was later added to the inquiries section of Philip's ledger. Inside the hidden office beneath the chapel, the orchid cabinet had been updated. The drawers had grown deeper, the categories had changed. Dormant had become monitored. Approaching was now viable. Resolved remained the same. A new fourth drawer had been added. It was labeled Complications. Cordelia Vane's folder had been moved there. So had Reverend Masters. Clara Beecher's name was scribbled onto a single page. No file, no estate. Philip had written, Transient, may return, watch post. In this same drawer, Philip kept a growing list of new arrivals he deemed risky. Too sharp, too social, family nearby. Each entry had a number beside it, ranging from 1 to 5. A 5 meant high alert. A 1 meant expendable. Every decision the Bellamys made was now guided by these silent rankings. Dr. Bellamy had developed new sedative blends, less detectable, more effective. Lenora insisted on a minimum of 12 hours of prayer per patient before any final injection. And Philip? He had discovered a loophole in New York's probate law. If a resident died intestate and with no immediate heirs, the hospice could file as the interim conservator and redirect assets to the church, a church that, on paper, had no members, just 3 officers, all of them named Bellamy. Downstairs, behind the chapel wall, the cabinet clicked shut. That same week, the home's newest resident, a retired banker with 2 houses and no children, began vomiting after dinner. Dr. Bellamy called it seasonal nerves. He would be dead by Sunday. They called him Mr. Harold Quince, though now no one knew if that was his real name. He arrived at Elm House in November of 1856 with a satchel, a wool coat, and a letter of transfer from a private asylum in Buffalo. According to the documents, he had suffered a catastrophic emotional collapse after a business failure and the death of his wife. No children, no siblings, assets unknown. The Bellamys didn't hesitate. He was placed in room 9. From the beginning, Mr. Quince was different. He was quiet, yes, but not confused, not entirely. He read often, mostly old newspapers. He spoke with a clipped accent that didn't quite match the region, and he walked the grounds every morning at 5 a.m., circling the gardens barefoot, muttering names under his breath, names that no one had told him. One evening, while Nurse Eliza brought him his nightly tea, Mr. Quince looked her dead in the eye and asked, "Did they burn the girl with the red ribbon?" Eliza froze. The tray trembled in her hands. Cordelia Vane had been buried, but years later, the orchard workers claimed her original grave had been disturbed, her body missing when it was relocated, and the only detail that remained in town gossip was the red ribbon tied around her wrist. Mr. Quince never should have known that. Philip grew nervous. He had the transfer records rechecked. Nothing stood out, no connections, no red flags, except Quince's unpredictability. Dr. Bellamy decided to proceed with caution. They began with small doses, a whisper of laudanum in his milk, a crushed valerian capsule beneath his tongue at night. Nothing that would kill yet, just enough to erode memory. But Harold Quince didn't fade, he sharpened. He began writing, pages, diaries, sketches of faces, lists of names, questions. One entry read, "They think I forget. I do not. I wait." Another, "Behind the chapel, door with iron lock. My turn soon." Lenora found the writings. She brought them to Everett. Everett brought them to Philip. That night, Mr. Quince's tea was served by Lenora herself. The next morning, he was found sitting upright in bed, eyes wide, mouth open, dead but calm. Dr. Bellamy listed the cause as cerebral event due to prolonged grief. But Philip added something else in the orchid drawer. Possibly investigative. Burial not advised. Cremate. The town of Ashcroft didn't have a crematorium. But after that day, the Elm House furnace burned hotter than ever before. No one in Ashcroft remembered approving it. No town records mentioned it. But sometime between the winter of 1856 and the spring of 1857, Elm House installed an industrial-grade furnace, far larger than anything needed for warmth. It ran on coal. It hummed day and night, and it was housed beneath the chapel, in a stone-lined room no one outside the Bellamy family ever entered. They said it was for laundry. But no one ever saw linens come out. By late spring, the scent drifting from the chimney changed. Less like soot, more like iron. The birds stopped nesting in the chapel eaves. Groundskeepers avoided the east courtyard. One even claimed the bricks around the furnace vents began to sweat on cool mornings. Philip Bellamy dismissed the rumors. The imagination runs wild in places of mourning, he said. But there was no denying the pattern. Residents who died suddenly, those without wills, those without heirs, those who left no property behind, were buried, quietly, quickly, under elm or cedar. But those with disputed estates, or those who had recently written letters expressing concerns, were cremated. It was Lenora who chose which ones. She would review the case notes late at night, seated at the writing desk in the hallway with a single candle burning. Once her decision was made, she would ring the chapel bell, once if the body would be buried, twice if it would be burned. No one outside the family knew what the bell meant, but the grounds staff learned to listen. After 2 rings, no graves were dug, and the furnace roared. In May of 1857, a local boy, Tommy Hepler, age 11, snuck onto the Elm House grounds on a dare. He wanted to steal a candle from the chapel. What he found instead was the ash chute, slightly ajar, still warm. Inside, he saw bones. Not many, just a small pile, but enough to know they didn't belong to any animal he'd seen. He told his father. His father told no one. Because 2 days later, that same father, Caleb Hepler, was found in the river with a broken neck. Officially, he'd fallen while fishing. Unofficially, his hands were tied with silk rope. Tommy never spoke of the chute again. He moved to Syracuse by the end of the month. That summer, Elm House added a second chimney, and Philip Bellamy made his first journal entry with the phrase, "Burn risk mitigated." The truth didn't live in Everett's medical notes or in Philip's forged legal files. It lived in Lenora's personal ledger. A slim, leather-bound journal hidden inside the back panel of her dressing armoire, sealed behind a false plank and wrapped in oilcloth. It wasn't discovered until years later, long after the furnace went cold, long after the chapel doors were nailed shut. But its pages held the heart of Elm House. It wasn't filled with confessions. Lenora never saw herself as a criminal. Instead, her entries read like prayers, bleak, deliberate, and intimate. Each one began with the same line. We return them to the Lord, pure and unburdened. And then, names. Mrs. Adeline Morse, lingering confusion, spoke of her late son, asked me if I was his wife. I kissed her forehead and gave her the tea. Mr. Malcolm Everly coughed blood after the 3rd dose, struggled. Everett calmed him. It was harder this time. Mrs. Blythe Connor said she saw angels walking the corridor. That meant she was ready. I let her see me cry. The tone was not remorseful. It was maternal. Lenora believed she was helping them, helping Everett, helping God. But buried between these ritual entries were cracks. April 1858. Philip says the orphanage fund is empty, that we must speed the transitions. I don't like the word harvest. July 1858. Everett does not sleep. He drinks now. Not wine, ether. The Lord is silent lately. September 1858. A man arrived today, pretending to be a resident's cousin. He asked too many questions. Philip says he will not be back. I believe him. There was one more kind of entry. Every few pages, Lenora listed items, not names, not illnesses, objects. Gold wedding rings, 6. Dentures, 11 pairs. Embroidered handkerchiefs with initials, 17. Lockets containing photos, 4. One music box, German, still plays. One blood-stained scarf, Cordelia's. And at the end of each list, a phrase repeated, "Do not burn these." What happened to those items is still unknown. Some say Lenora buried them. Others believe she stored them somewhere deep within the chapel's foundations. But one theory stands above the rest. She kept them, every last one, as trophies or as penance. A silent archive of every life she ended. Mrs. Adeline Morse, lingering confusion, spoke of her late son, asked me if I was his wife. I kissed her forehead and gave her the tea. Mr. Malcolm Everly coughed blood after the 3rd dose. Struggled. Everett calmed him. It was harder this time. Mrs. Blythe Connor said she saw angels walking the corridor, and that meant she was ready. I let her see me cry. The tone was not remorseful. It was maternal. Lenora believed she was helping them, helping Everett, helping God. But buried between these ritual entries were cracks. April 1858. Philip says the orphanage fund is empty, that we must speed the transitions. I don't like the word harvest. July 1858. Everett does not sleep. He drinks now. Not wine, ether. The Lord is silent lately. September 1858. A man arrived today pretending to be a resident's cousin. He asked too many questions. Philip says he will not be back. I believe him. There was one more kind of entry. Every few pages, Lenora listed items, not names, not illnesses, objects. Gold wedding rings, 6. Dentures, 11 pairs. Embroidered handkerchiefs with initials, 17. Lockets containing photos, 4. One music box, German, still plays. One bloodstained scarf, Cordelia's. And at the end of each list, a phrase repeated, "Do not burn these." What happened to those items is still unknown. Some say Lenora buried them. Others believe she stored them somewhere deep within the chapel's foundations. But one theory stands above the rest. She kept them, every last one, as trophies or as penance. A silent archive of every life she ended. Agatha Wren didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She wrote. From her room near the furnace door, still weak but lucid, Agatha penned a letter, short, precise, and deliberate. She wrote it in the early hours of the morning, using the pencil and stationery she had kept in her trunk since the day she arrived. She addressed it to her niece, Charlotte, in Boston. She did not detail everything. Agatha was too clever for that. Instead, she hinted. "The people here are not what they seem. I fear there is a darkness beneath the prayers. If this reaches you, come quickly, and bring someone who can open locked doors." Then, without telling anyone, Agatha gave the letter to the new kitchen boy, Eli, 14 years old and too new to understand the rules. She told him it was a grocery order for the town's general store and gave him a coin for sweets. Eli did as he was told. The letter left Elm House. It arrived in Boston 3 days later. Charlotte, skeptical but worried, brought it to Inspector Simon Greeley, a family acquaintance and former Pinkerton agent. He read it twice, then made preparations to travel. Quietly, no telegrams, no police escort. He arrived in Ashcroft at dusk, unannounced. At the front door of Elm House, Lenora greeted him as though he were a wandering parishioner. She wore a gray shawl and carried a Bible. Everett appeared behind her, calm, even welcoming. Philip stayed hidden. Greeley gave no reason for his visit. He claimed he was in town on personal business. He asked if he could stay a night in one of the guest rooms, as he was acquainted with Miss Wren's family. Lenora hesitated. Everett nodded. "Of course," he said, smiling. "We are always honored to host men of the cloth." That night, Inspector Greeley didn't sleep. He watched. He listened. He wandered the halls barefoot at midnight and found the chapel doors slightly ajar. Inside, he saw a curtain. Behind the curtain, a door. But it was locked. In the morning, he asked to speak with Miss Wren. He was told she had taken ill again, too weak for visitors. But Greeley had already seen her. Hours earlier, while slipping through the rear corridor, he had spotted her through a half-closed door, sitting up in bed, awake and afraid. Inspector Simon Greeley was no stranger to liars. He had seen them cry, pray, bribe, and beg. But the Bellamys were something else. They didn't act like criminals hiding secrets. They acted like a family protecting a legacy. After his brief glimpse of Agatha, Greeley knew two things. She was not dying, and she was being silenced. He began his investigation in the garden, not the front, where visitors were allowed to stroll past trimmed hedges and white benches. No, the back garden. The one behind the chapel, overgrown and crooked, where the earth didn't settle quite right. He took note of the ground's texture. Fresh soil over old. No grass, no moss. Just turned earth that felt too soft. He counted 15 markers, but only 6 names. The rest were blank crosses or faded initials. Greeley was no undertaker, but he'd seen hasty burials before. And this was a field of them. That night, he returned with a trowel and lantern. By midnight, he had dug less than 2 feet before hitting wood. A coffin, cheap, unvarnished, unsealed. Inside was the body of an elderly man, hands crossed, mouth slightly open. But something was wrong. There were no records of any male residents buried that month. The man had been dead only days. Greeley replaced the soil and made a mental note. The graves didn't match the ledger Lenora had shown him earlier that day. In fact, half of the names were missing entirely. The next morning, he asked to speak with Dr. Bellamy about final rites for the deceased. Everett invited him into his study, where medical books were stacked neatly alongside volumes of scripture. The doctor answered questions calmly, even offered tea. But Greeley noticed something on the wall, a framed certificate from Harvard Medical College. He leaned closer. The seal had been traced, faked, and when Greeley looked behind the frame, tucked between the wall and backing board, he found a folded piece of paper, a ledger sheet, names, dates, dosages. At the bottom, 2 words scribbled in red, Wren, incomplete. By noon, Greeley was preparing to leave. He had seen enough. He told the Bellamys he would return with a proper clergy escort. That evening, he took a walk to town to send a letter back east. He never arrived. His coat was found by the river the next morning, torn. His body was never recovered. But Agatha Wren? She was moved that very night to the furnace room. The chapel bell rang once. They told the staff Miss Wren had died peacefully, in her sleep, with a prayer on her lips. No one was to enter her room. The linens were burned. Her trunk was emptied. Her name was scratched from the hallway register. Within 24 hours, there was no trace she'd ever existed, except for one thing: the ashes. By the next morning, several staff noticed a strange gray residue coating the windowsills in the west wing, fine as flour, but sticky when wet. Nurse Eliza found it clinging to the curtains in room 6, the same room Miss Wren had occupied before being moved. And then there was the odor. Not rot, not mildew. Something else. Something metallic, like burnt teeth and oil. The furnace had run for 11 hours straight that night. Groundskeeper Matthias told the cook he'd never seen it glow so hot. The stone around the ash chute had cracked. Even the iron handle had begun to warp. And yet, no death certificate had been filed. Philip hadn't written the usual confirmed in the ledger. Her file was still in the complications drawer. At the bottom, Everett had scrawled a single line: refused the final dose. Incineration initiated while conscious, contained. But the Bellamys hadn't expected what came next. 2 days later, Lenora was seen wandering the halls at 4 a.m., muttering verses under her breath. Staff reported seeing smoke trailing behind her, though none could confirm it. A maid swore she saw footprints of ash leading into the chapel, but when she returned with a candle, they were gone. That Sunday, during evening prayers, the chapel organ began playing by itself. The keys moved, but no one sat at the bench. Philip ordered it locked. By Monday, 3 residents had refused their medications. By Tuesday, 2 nurses quit without explanation. On Wednesday, the new cook, a woman named Alma hired only a month prior, entered the apothecary by mistake and found Miss Wren's locket hanging from a nail above the scale. Inside the locket, a scrap of burned paper, blackened but legible. It read, "I remember everything." Alma fled the estate. She boarded a train south that same night. She told no one what she saw, but she left her apron behind, folded neatly, with gray fingerprints pressed into the fabric. The Bellamys never mentioned Miss Wren again, but the chapel bell? It rang by itself every Sunday night, for 7 weeks straight. In the spring of 1860, something shifted. The elm trees around the chapel began to rot from the inside. Bark peeled like burned skin. Roots bulged above the soil, knotting over headstones as if trying to push the graves back up. Birds refused to nest in their branches. One collapsed during a rainstorm, crushing 3 of the oldest crosses. Lenora claimed it was a blight, but the townspeople, those who still dared speak of Elm House, had another theory. "The ground's tired," said Mrs. Lillian from the apothecary. "Too full, too heavy." It was the same month the foundation of the chapel cracked clean down the middle, from altar to pew. Father Claiborne, who had not visited in years, stopped by to inspect the damage and left white as linen. "There are no saints in that place," he muttered. "Only ash." Behind closed doors, the Bellamy family unraveled. Philip stopped attending devotionals. He took to his cellar office, locking himself in for days, emerging only to burn papers. Lenora wandered the halls at night, humming hymns with no melody. Everett sat by the window of his study, gazing into the orchard with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. He hadn't touched a patient in weeks. Their empire was rotting from within. Then came the letters. One by one, family members of former residents, nieces, cousins, distant brothers, began writing to Elm House. Curious inquiries, questions about estates, about the conditions of death, about rumors they'd heard from townsfolk, from a former staffer named Alma, now living 2 states south. Philip panicked. He began forging replies, dozens at a time. Lenora intercepted some and burned them, but one letter made it through, to a state auditor in Albany. An investigation was opened. Quiet, for now, but not silent. Everett knew what was coming. He wrote a single entry in his journal that April. We mistook silence for grace. On May 3rd, before re-dawn, a fire broke out in the chapel. It wasn't electrical. It wasn't accidental. The furnace exploded. The bell tower collapsed. The organ melted where it stood. By sunrise, Elm House was gone. The Bellamys were never seen again. No bodies were found. No arrest ever made. But weeks later, in the ashes behind the chapel, a sheriff found something strange. A row of small wooden crosses, new, unmarked, neatly planted in a circle. At the center, in scorched soil, sat a silver locket. It was warm to the touch, and inside, a scrap of cloth embroidered with a single word, Wren.